Why did Maine break away from Massachusetts? The state of Maine is a quiet corner of the modern United States that is easily forgotten by those outside it. Maine was a province of Massachusetts from 1647 and remained so through the American Revolution. When it became a part of the United States under Massachusetts' control, it was a relatively unimportant corner of the new nation, with barely 10,000 people calling it home. Most of the population lived along the coast and depended upon maritime trade along the eastern seaboard. A smaller but growing share of the population lived inland, including the native populations and the colonists, working as farmers or in the thriving timber trade. After the Revolution, the Massachusetts state government and social elites took control of the land in Maine that they'd seized from the defeated Royalists. The government had war debts to repay, and the elites had fortunes to build, so they began selling off the land to new settlers. These prices were often exorbitant and exploitative. Settlers who had settled on old Royalist land found themselves being forced to pay for the privilege after it was seized by the authorities. By far the most infamous of these great proprietors was General Henry Knox. A veteran of the Revolution and a close friend of Washington, Knox had served as his Secretary of State for War and was immensely popular with the state and national elites. Knox managed to secure control of a large part of Maine after the Revolution and subjected his tenants to exploitative rents and aggressive enforcement. High taxes also weighed heavily on Mainers. Maine's soil was poor and its growing seasons short, making it tough for the farmers to make ends meet, let alone pay the high rents and taxes demanded of them. It didn't help that Massachusetts politics was dominated by Federalists, who had little interest in the common people and preferred government to be controlled by the educated and privileged. The land proprietors and the government were closely linked socially and politically. For example, Knox was close friends with the president of the state senate, David Cobb, and Knox's son-in-law was one of the state's representatives in Congress. Perhaps more grating was religion. Massachusetts' elite were Congregationalists, who were using taxpayer money to fund churches and ministers for their denomination. The Mainers were a more diverse mix, which included Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians. Throw on top of that the lack of representation in state government for rural Maine, and it's no wonder why the Mainers came to oppose the whole Massachusetts system. It didn't take long for Mainers to begin physically resisting. Through the 1790s and 1800s, there were many examples of Mainers taking a stand against their exploitation. Debt collectors and taxmen were hounded, in some cases kidnapped, stripped, and publicly humiliated. Enforcers for the landlords awoke to find empty coffins delivered to their doorstep. In more violent cases, agents of the government and the landlords were dragged to the ground and had their horses killed. However, only once was someone killed, and the culprits immediately surrendered themselves to the authorities afterwards. By the early 1800s, the people of Maine were the perfect audience for Jefferson's new Democratic-Republican Party. They envisioned an America of small landholders and smaller government, allowing for greater freedom and individual liberty, in contrast to the almost aristocratic attitudes of the Federalists. In the 1807 elections, the Mainers voted overwhelmingly for Democratic Republicans, enabling them to form a new government in Massachusetts. Combined with Knox's death in 1806, he caught an infection after swallowing a chicken bone. The old Federalists had been crippled. However, the Democratic Republicans weren't all that much better, passing some minor land reform bills and lessening the burden on rural families, but things were still bad enough in Maine that it saw an exodus of thousands to Ohio in the late 1800s and early 1810s. There were rumblings of an independent state of Maine by this point. A referendum was held on the issue, but it was soundly defeated. There were still hopes of solving Maine's issues within Massachusetts, but those hopes evaporated with the War of 1812. The War of 1812 erupted after years of British harassment of U.S. ships and sailors. Sitting on the border with British territory, Maine was vulnerable. Unfortunately, the Federalist Caleb Strong had been elected governor weeks before the war broke out, and he had British sympathies. The Massachusetts government did little to protect Maine, and actively blocked President Madison's attempt to organize troops and funds for the province's defense, leading to Madison eventually giving up and withdrawing federal troops to be reassigned to more loyal areas. Meanwhile, some Federalists began talking about making a deal with the British, and Governor Strong secretly sent messengers to inquire about British support for Massachusetts' secession. Maine was left to fend for itself. They were all but helpless when British troops marched into their territory in summer 1814 and occupied everything east of the Penobscot River. Maine's merchants had no protection from the British ships prowling the coast. Belfast, Bangor, and other towns were looted and burned. A scattered militia took up arms to defend their homes, but it stood alone. By the time the war ended in February 1815, the mood in Maine had shifted firmly against Boston. The failures and apathy of the state government had been the final straw. From 1815 to 1819, a true Maine statehood movement emerged, growing year by year until its calls were too loud to ignore. Before long, even Federalists were calling for Maine's independence as a state, if only to be rid of the headache. The merchant class were the last serious holdouts. Their objection to statehood hinged on a single specific law, the Coasting Law of 1789, which required ships to dock and register in every state that their home state did not share a border with. As part of Massachusetts, this wasn't much of an issue, and ships could travel as far as New Jersey before needing to dock. If they went independent, those same traders would need to dock in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York, an expensive and time-consuming process that could ruin many of the traders. That obstacle too fell away, repealed by Congress in 1819, and immediately support for statehood swelled over the time. On June 19th, Massachusetts General Court passed legislation enabling statehood for Maine, and voters confirmed it in a referendum the following month. Maine's political leaders quickly drew up a state constitution, which was approved in October. All that remained was for Maine to be accepted by Congress. However, the Massachusetts General Court had a condition. They did not want to drag out the issue forever, so they set a deadline. Congress and the President needed to approve Maine's statehood by March 14, 1820, or else they'd remain a part of Massachusetts. The clock was ticking, but like so much else in American history in this period, Maine's quest for statehood would be interrupted by the issue of the day: slavery. Maine's application for statehood arrived at a difficult time in Washington. Missouri had made its statehood application earlier in 1819, but Congress had reached an impasse over the slavery issue. Naturally, as a southern state, Missouri sought admission to the Union as a slaving state. The 22 existing states were perfectly balanced between free and slave, and power in the Senate would shift in favor of slavery if Missouri was admitted. The free states refused to let this happen. Missouri's statehood application had passed through the House in February 1819, where Representative James Talmadge Jr. had added an amendment prohibiting any more slaves being brought into the state. The House, with its anti-slavery majority, passed it, but the Senate, with its balanced free and slave split, ripped out the amendment, only for the House to shoot down the new version of the bill. Tempers were high on both sides when Maine's application for statehood arrived. Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky saw this as an opportunity. He proposed a simple compromise. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, while Maine would come as a free state. The balance would be preserved, and neither side lost their power. It seemed like a simple fix, but not everyone agreed. Maine's soaring population might tilt the House of Representatives further towards the abolitionists. Meanwhile, many abolitionists weren't willing to condone the extension of slavery under any circumstances. The moral and political debate raged in Washington and across the nation as time ticked away towards the March 4th deadline. In the end, though, the deadline ended up being Maine's saving grace. It prevented the debate dragging on indefinitely and forced Congress to vote, but it was close. On March 3rd, mere hours before Massachusetts' deadline, the House voted to admit Maine. But the victory was bittersweet. The Missouri Compromise, as it became known, secured Maine's statehood, at the price of protecting slavery for decades over a large chunk of the US. It was a steep price, one many abolitionists didn't think was worth it. This included 5 of Maine's 7 House representatives, inherited from Massachusetts, who voted against the Missouri Compromise and against their own statehood on those moral grounds. Whatever the morality of it, Maine ceased to be a part of Massachusetts and became America's 23rd state on March 15, 1820. Missouri followed as number 24 in August 1821, following further delays and debates over the slavery issue.